The clock on the ICU wall read 12:03 a.m. The faint tick of its hands seemed louder than usual against the otherwise still night. Nurse Eliza Matthews adjusted the strap of her stethoscope and took a deep breath before starting her next round. She had worked countless night shifts, but this one felt unusually heavy, as if the air itself was carrying a secret. The ICU at St. Francis Hospital was quiet. Unnervingly so. The usual symphony of beeping monitors, hissing oxygen machines, and distant intercom announcements was muted tonight. Even the overhead lights had been dimmed to a warm amber glow, casting long shadows down the hall. Most of the rooms were closed, their patients resting under the watchful care of machines and medication. Eliza's shoes squeaked faintly against the polished linoleum as she approached room 312. Inside was Mrs. Catherine Carter, a woman in her late 60s, who had been in a coma for nearly a month after a severe stroke. Eliza had been one of the first nurses to treat her, and over the weeks, she'd developed a strange sense of connection to the woman. She would sometimes talk to her while checking her vitals, telling her about the weather, the news, or even her own life, just in case Mrs. Carter could hear. But tonight, as Eliza rounded the corner toward 312, she stopped in her tracks. The door, which she always kept closed during night hours to limit noise, was slightly ajar. A thin sliver of light spilled out into the hallway. Her brow furrowed. Visiting hours in the ICU ended at 8 p.m., and the staff was strict about it. Only in rare emergency situations did anyone allow visitors past that time, and Eliza hadn't been informed of any exceptions tonight. Quietly, she pushed the door open. There at Mrs. Carter's bedside stood a tall man in a dark coat. His posture was rigid, his shoulders squared as he leaned slightly toward the unconscious patient. His head was bowed, as though speaking in a whisper, meant only for her ears. The faint hum of the heart monitor provided the only sound in the room besides the low murmur of his voice. "Excuse me, sir," Eliza said, her tone firm but polite. The man didn't react immediately. His head remained lowered, his lips still moving in hushed tones. It was as if he hadn't heard her at all, or worse, was deliberately ignoring her. A chill trickled down Eliza's spine. "Sir?" she repeated, stepping closer. Finally, he straightened and turned toward her. His face was pale, his jaw sharp, his eyes a piercing shade of gray that seemed to study her rather than acknowledge her authority. I'm her nephew," he said, his voice flat. Eliza frowned inwardly. She'd reviewed Mrs. Carter's file many times and didn't remember any mention of a nephew. In fact, over the past month, not a single family member had visited. "I see," she said carefully. "We have strict visiting policies after hours. You'll need to sign in at the nurse's station." The man didn't answer. Instead, he slipped his hands into his coat pockets, gave her one final unreadable look, and walked past her toward the door. His steps were slow, deliberate, almost soundless on the hospital floor. By the time Eliza stepped into the hallway, he had already vanished around the corner. She stood there for a moment, her mind uneasy. Something about him felt off, not just his unannounced presence, but the way he had looked at her, as though sizing her up. She made a mental note to check the visitor logs and security cameras later in the shift. For now, she turned back toward Mrs. Carter's bed. The elderly woman lay motionless, her chest rising and falling in a steady rhythm. Everything in the room appeared untouched, but Eliza couldn't shake the feeling that something had just happened here. Something she hadn't yet discovered. After the strange man's visit, the rest of Eliza's shift felt heavier, like an invisible weight had settled on her shoulders. She tried to brush it off, reminding herself that hospitals often attracted worried relatives who bent the rules. Still, his cold grey stare kept replaying in her mind. At 2:15 a.m., during her scheduled break, Eliza decided she couldn't let it go. She headed toward the security office, tucked away at the far end of the hospital's administrative wing. The hallway leading there was dim, lit only by flickering fluorescent panels that buzzed faintly overhead. The security desk was manned by Paul, a middle-aged guard with thinning hair and a coffee cup permanently attached to his hand. He greeted her with a puzzled look. "Matthews?" "What brings you here at this hour?" he asked, leaning back in his chair. Eliza glanced over her shoulder before stepping closer.
Paul, I need you to pull the security footage from around 12 a.m. to 12:15 a.m. Specifically outside and inside. Room.
Paul raised an eyebrow. "Something happened." She hesitated. "Let's just say I had an unexpected visitor tonight. A man claiming to be Mrs. Carter's nephew, but he's not listed in her file." Paul's expression tightened. Without another question, he swiveled toward his monitor and began typing. The hum of the computer filled the silence as the footage from the hallway outside room 312 began to play. At first, everything was normal. Empty hall. No movement. Then, at 12:02 a.m., a figure entered the frame from the east corridor. The tall man in the dark coat. His head was slightly bowed, his hands deep in his pockets. He moved with unnerving calm, glancing neither left nor right, before slipping into 312, without hesitation. Paul scrubbed the footage backward. "Where did he come from?" Eliza asked, leaning over his shoulder. They rewound another 30 seconds, and what they saw made Eliza's stomach knot. The man didn't enter from the elevator or the main stairwell. He simply appeared at the end of the hallway, stepping into view as though he'd been standing in the shadows, waiting.
Paul frowned. "There's no camera on that corner. It's one of our blind spots. But here's the thing. To get into this floor at night, you need a security badge."
Eliza's pulse quickened. "So how did he get up here?" Paul fast-forwarded to when the man left. At 12:10 a.m., the door to 312 opened, and he stepped back into the hallway. But something about his exit was different. He paused just outside the door and slowly turned his head toward the security camera, as if he knew it was there. Then, with a faint smirk, he walked away. "Creepy," Paul muttered. "Follow him," Eliza said. They tracked the footage through several hallways, but after the man passed the nurse's station on the west side, he walked into another blind spot and never came out the other side. No stairwell, no elevator, no door opened. It was as though he had vanished into thin air. Paul leaned back in his chair, visibly unsettled. "I've been here 15 years, and I've never seen anything like that." Eliza crossed her arms. "Check the main entrance. Maybe he left the building." Paul switched to the exterior cameras. They fast-forwarded through several minutes of quiet nighttime street views, lit by the yellow glow of the street lamps. No sign of the man. No dark coat. No gray-eyed stranger.
Eliza felt a prickling sensation at the back of her neck. Whoever that man was, he hadn't entered through official means, and now there was no trace of him leaving.
Before she left the security office, Paul promised to make a copy of the footage. "Be careful, Matthews. If this guy shows up again, call me first, no matter what time it is." Eliza nodded, but her mind was already elsewhere. Something told her the man wasn't done, and neither was whatever he had started in room 3. The following evening, Eliza arrived at the hospital 15 minutes earlier than her shift required. She couldn't shake the unease from the night before. As soon as she changed into her scrubs, she made her way straight to room 3. Mrs. Carter lay in bed, exactly as before, motionless, her pale face illuminated by the soft green glow of the heart monitor. The gentle rise and fall of her chest was steady, almost hypnotic. But as Eliza stepped closer, she noticed something she couldn't explain. The air in the room felt different. It wasn't colder or warmer. It was heavier, as though the walls themselves were holding their breath. She checked the IV line, the oxygen flow, and the monitors, all normal. Still, an odd sensation crept over her. Miss Carter's skin, which had been clammy the day before, now had more warmth to it. Eliza frowned and reached for the patient's chart. No new medication had been administered. No interventions. And yet her skin tone looked less ashen, her lips less dry. At 8:12 p.m., Eliza took Mrs. Carter's blood pressure. It was slightly elevated compared to the previous night. Not alarmingly so, but enough to note. "Well, that's unusual," she murmured to herself. A soft voice startled her from behind. "She looks better, doesn't she?" Eliza turned sharply to see Dr. Hughes, the attending physician, standing in the doorway. His eyes were locked on Mrs. Carter, his expression unreadable. "Yes," Eliza said cautiously. "But there's no medical reason for it. Nothing in her record suggests a sudden improvement." Dr. Hughes stepped in, his shoes clicking softly on the tile. "Sometimes patients rally for no reason. We can explain. Could be coincidence." Eliza wanted to believe that, but the image of the grey-eyed stranger from the night before burned in her mind. She couldn't shake the idea that his visit had triggered this shift. When Hughes left, she stayed in the room longer than necessary, almost expecting Mrs. Carter to suddenly open her eyes. The rhythmic beeping of the monitor filled the silence. Eliza finally forced herself to leave, but her curiosity gnawed at her all night. Around midnight, she returned for another check. This time she froze in the doorway. Mrs. Carter's fingers were twitching. It wasn't random muscle spasms. The movement was deliberate, as if she were trying to grasp something. Eliza's heart pounded as she moved to the bedside.
"Mrs. Carter?"
"Can you hear me?" she whispered. The patient's eyelids fluttered, but didn't fully open. Her lips parted just slightly, releasing a faint rasping sound. Eliza leaned in closer. "Water?" she asked, reaching for a swab to moisten her mouth. But before she could, Mrs. Carter's lips formed two barely audible words. "He's coming." Eliza's breath caught in her throat. "Who's coming?" she pressed gently. But Mrs. Carter's brief burst of awareness faded. Her body relaxed again, her breathing steady, the twitching gone. Eliza stumbled backward, gripping the chart so tightly her knuckles turned white. Those words could mean anything, but deep down, she knew they were connected to last night's visitor. She immediately made a note in the patient's file and flagged it for Dr. Hughes, but she didn't include the exact words. Something told her this wasn't the kind of thing to broadcast in hospital records. Her mind raced. If the man really had done something to her patient, what was his goal? And why had he come without leaving a trace? The rest of the night passed in a haze of paranoia. Every time footsteps echoed down the hall, Eliza's pulse spiked. She checked room 312 more times than necessary, half expecting to find the man standing there again. But he never came. Still, the echo of Mrs. Carter's whisper clung to her, crawling under her skin. "He's coming." The next evening, Eliza arrived at the hospital with a knot in her stomach. She barely noticed the usual bustle of nurses trading reports, the faint hum of the vending machines, or the distant squeak of a cleaning cart. Her mind was locked on one thing. Room 3. She walked straight there before even clocking in, peeking through the narrow glass pane in the door. Mrs. Carter lay still, monitors beeping in steady rhythm. At first glance, nothing seemed unusual, until Eliza saw the faintest flicker of movement near the corner of the room. Her breath hitched. It wasn't the patient this time. The shadow shifted against the wall, not caused by any of the equipment or her own silhouette. She pushed the door open quietly, stepping inside. The air felt heavier again, charged with a strange tension. "Who's there?" she asked, keeping her voice steady. The corner remained still for a moment. Then a man stepped forward, emerging from the shadows. It was him, the grey-eyed stranger. Eliza's chest tightened, but she forced herself to speak. "Visiting hours are over. You're not allowed to be here." He didn't respond at first, simply glancing at Mrs. Carter, his expression unreadable, part longing, part sorrow. Finally, he spoke, his voice low and steady. "I told you before she's not ready to go yet." Eliza frowned. "What do you mean? Are you family?" "I'm more than that," he said, taking another step toward the bed. "She saved me once. Now it's my turn." The words sent a chill down her spine. She instinctively positioned herself between him and the patient. "You can't be in here. If you don't leave, I'll have security escort you out." He studied her for a moment, as if weighing her resolve. Then he sighed and reached into his coat pocket. Eliza tensed. But instead of a weapon, he pulled out a small, weathered photograph. It showed a younger Mrs. Carter, vibrant and smiling, standing beside the very same man. His hair was darker, but those grey eyes were unmistakable. They were standing in front of a wrecked car, as if the picture had been taken right after a rescue. "She pulled me from that," he said softly. "Told me my life was worth saving, even when I didn't believe it myself. And now," his gaze fell to her frail form on the bed, "it's my turn to keep her here a little longer." Eliza's mouth went dry. She didn't know what to believe. None of this explained the sudden improvement in Mrs. Carter's condition. Before she could reply, the patient stirred again. Her eyelids trembled, and her lips parted. Eliza leaned over quickly, but this time, Mrs. Carter's gaze focused directly on the man. "You came back," she whispered. The stranger smiled faintly. "I never left." A tear slipped down her cheek, and Eliza stood frozen, caught between awe and disbelief. The monitor beeped faster, not in distress, but in a rhythm that suggested life, strength, returning. Dr. Hughes burst in, alerted by the change in vitals. "What's going on here?" he demanded, eyeing the man suspiciously. But when Hughes stepped forward, the stranger simply backed into the shadows again. For the briefest moment, his eyes met Eliza's, as if urging her to keep his presence a secret. Then, as the doctor turned his head, the man was gone, as if he had melted into the air. The room fell silent, except for the monitors. Hughes checked Mrs. Carter, baffled at her sudden responsiveness. This doesn't make sense," he muttered. Eliza didn't answer. She couldn't, because she knew, though she couldn't prove it, that the man had somehow given Mrs. Carter the strength to return. Later that night, as Eliza sat at the nurse's station filling out her report, she glanced toward the darkened hallway. For a split second, she thought she saw those gray eyes watching her from the end of the corridor. And though he vanished in the blink of an eye, she felt no fear this time. Only the strange, unshakable knowledge that some bonds run deeper than life itself.